The congregation first noticed the man as he entered through the large wooden doors of the church. His arrival was almost ghost-like, unnoticed at first, until the quiet creak of the heavy doors echoed through the hall. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the room. He wasn't dressed like the others in attendance. His dark clothing, mismatched layers, and worn boots contrasted starkly with the neat suits and modest dresses worn by the churchgoers. But it wasn't his attire that caught everyone's attention. It was the black box he carried. The box, small enough to hold in both hands but strangely weighty in appearance, was made of what looked like old, polished wood. Its surface gleamed under the church's soft lighting, but there were faint markings etched into it, symbols no one could quite make out from a distance. It had a brass clasp that gleamed faintly, locked tightly. The man clutched it with an almost possessive grip, his fingers curling around its edges as though it contained something precious or dangerous. Whispers began circulating among the congregation as he moved down the center aisle. Who is he? What's in the box? Do you think he's here for the service? The man, seemingly unfazed by the attention, made his way to the last pew and sat down silently, placing the box carefully on the seat beside him. He didn't join in the hymns, didn't bow his head during prayers. Instead, he sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the altar, his fingers occasionally brushing the top of the box. The tension in the room was palpable. While the service carried on, more and more people found their attention drawn to the stranger. Some felt a creeping sense of unease, as though his presence disrupted the sanctity of the space. Others were simply curious, intrigued by the mystery of the man and his box. A few exchanged nervous glances, their instincts warning them that something was off. The priest, too, noticed the man's unusual behavior, but chose to continue the service, his calm demeanor masking the growing unease in his heart. As the service went on, the man's behavior became increasingly unsettling. He occasionally leaned forward, as if struggling with an internal debate. At one point, his lips moved, though no sound came out. Some thought he was praying, while others wondered if he was speaking to himself or something else. Each time someone attempted to approach him, his posture stiffened and his grip on the box tightened. It became clear he did not want to be disturbed. When the service concluded, the congregation began to disperse, though many lingered, their curiosity getting the better of them. The man remained seated, his head lowered slightly, and the black box now placed firmly on his lap. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into cautious action as one of the churchgoers, a tall, older man with a commanding presence, decided to approach him. "Excuse me, sir," the man began, his tone polite but firm. "Is everything all right? May I ask what you're carrying there?" The stranger lifted his head, his eyes locking onto the older man with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "It's something everyone needs to see," he said, his voice calm, but layered with an eerie undertone. The cryptic reply only deepened the sense of unease. Several people who overheard gasped softly, their imaginations running wild with possibilities. The priest, sensing the growing unrest, stepped forward. He approached with a gentle authority, his hands clasped in front of him as he addressed the stranger. "My son," he said, his voice steady and soothing. "You seem troubled. This is a place of peace and understanding. If there's something weighing on you, we can help. But I must ask, what is inside that box?" The man's expression softened slightly, as if relieved that someone was finally addressing him directly. Slowly, he stood, clutching the box close to his chest. The movement drew the attention of everyone still in the church, their collective gaze fixed on the man and his mysterious burden. The stranger turned to the priest and said, "You may not want to know, but once it's opened, there's no going back." This statement sent a ripple of unease through the room. Some took an instinctive step back, while others moved closer, driven by a morbid curiosity. The priest exchanged a quick glance with the older man who had first approached the stranger, a silent understanding passing between them. "I believe it is best," the priest said gently but firmly, "that we open it now." Whatever you have brought into this sacred space must be brought into the light." The stranger hesitated, his grip on the box tightening. For a moment it seemed he might refuse. Then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded and stepped forward, his movements deliberate, his gaze unwavering. The congregation held their breath as he walked toward the altar, the black box clutched tightly in his hands. The tension in the room reached a fever pitch as he placed the box on the altar with a heavy thud. All eyes were on him as he carefully unlatched the clasp, the metallic click echoing eerily in the silence. The air felt charged, as though something unseen had entered the room, waiting to reveal itself. The room felt electric, charged with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Every pair of eyes was locked on the black box as the man's hands hovered above it, his fingers trembling slightly. The congregation, which had been murmuring moments earlier, now stood silent, their collective breaths held. The priest, standing only a few feet away, could feel his own heart pounding in his chest, though he maintained a calm outward appearance. The man hesitated, as if battling some unseen force, or his own inner fears. "Are you sure you want to see this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, a final warning that only heightened the tension. When no one answered, he took a deep breath, muttered something under his breath, words that sounded like a prayer or perhaps a plea, and opened the box. At first, there was nothing but silence. Those closest to the altar leaned forward, their eyes straining to make sense of what they were seeing. Then came the gasps, sharp and sudden, spreading like wildfire through the congregation. People recoiled instinctively, some covering their mouths in shock, others stepping back as if distance might shield them from whatever horrors the box contained. A woman in the front pew fainted, slumping against her husband, who caught her just in time. Inside the box was a grotesque sight, something that defied immediate comprehension. Resting on a bed of old, tattered cloth was what appeared to be a withered, discolored object, human-like in shape, but horribly distorted. It resembled a shriveled hand, though its fingers were unnaturally elongated, tipped with what looked like blackened, claw-like nails. The skin, if it could even be called that, was mottled and stretched tight over the misshapen form, giving it an almost mummified appearance. But it wasn't just the physical grotesqueness that unsettled everyone. There was something more, something intangible, a sense of malevolence that seemed to radiate from the object. It was as if the very air around it had grown heavier, suffused with a darkness that pressed down on everyone in the room. Several people later swore they could feel it watching them, though it had no eyes. Next to the object were handwritten notes yellowed with age and covered in spidery, almost illegible script. The words were written in a language that no one immediately recognized, though some symbols bore a passing resemblance to ancient runes. One brave man, unable to resist his curiosity, stepped closer to get a better look. As his eyes scanned the page, he suddenly froze, his face turning ashen. It's talking about summoning," he stammered, his voice trembling. "It's some kind of ritual." The priest took a cautious step forward, his gaze fixed on the box's contents. "What is this?" he asked, his voice firm despite the unease tightening his throat. "Where did you get this?" The stranger looked up, his expression a mixture of guilt and fear. "It's been in my family for generations," he said, his voice cracking. "We were told to never open it, to never let it see the light of day. But..." He trailed off, his eyes darting around the room. "It's like it was calling to me. I couldn't ignore it anymore." The room erupted into chaos. People began shouting over one another, their fear and confusion spilling out in frantic bursts. "Why would you bring that here?" someone yelled. "This is a house of God," another cried. Children clung to their parents, their wide eyes reflecting the fear etched into every adult face. The priest raised his hands, calling for calm, but his voice was drowned out by the growing panic. As the stranger tried to explain further, a loud, unnatural creak echoed through the church. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, silencing the crowd instantly. The object in the box appeared to shift slightly, though no one had touched it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, seemed to emanate from the altar. Several people screamed and a few bolted for the doors, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The priest, summoning his courage, stepped closer to the box. He reached out a trembling hand toward the notes, intending to examine them more closely. But as his fingers brushed the edge of the paper, he recoiled with a sharp gasp. "It's cold," he said, his voice filled with astonishment. "Colder than ice." The stranger nodded solemnly. "It's not just an object," he said. "It's alive, in a way. Or something is attached to it. I brought it here because I thought the church could purify it, or at least keep it safe. But now, I'm not so sure." The priest's mind raced. He had dealt with strange occurrences before, unexplained phenomena, whispers of the supernatural, but nothing like this. He turned to the congregation, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "We must pray," he said. "Whatever this is, we must confront it with faith and strength." But as he spoke, the air grew colder, and the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows seemed to waver, as if some unseen force was sapping the life from the room. The congregation, now visibly shaken, fell to their knees, their voices rising in desperate prayer. The priest, clutching his rosary tightly, began reciting a blessing, his words firm and deliberate. Yet the sense of dread only deepened, as though the prayers were falling on deaf ears, or worse, provoking whatever malevolence had been unleashed. The box sat on the altar, its dark presence dominating the room, as if daring anyone to challenge it. The stranger's hand shook as he closed the black box, snapping the brass clasp shut with a trembling finality. The congregation stared at him, their fear and curiosity burning holes into his composure. The priest, though outwardly calm, could not ignore the weight pressing down on the room, the oppressive, suffocating presence that seemed to emanate from the box, even when sealed. After a long, tense silence, the priest finally spoke. "We need to understand what this is," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You say it has been in your family for generations. Tell us everything you know." The man nodded reluctantly and sank onto a nearby pew, clutching the box as though it were a lifeline, or perhaps a curse he couldn't let go of. He avoided the congregation's piercing gazes, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It's hard to explain," he began, his voice hoarse. "I don't even know everything myself, but I'll tell you what I was told." The room fell silent, the tension thick as everyone leaned in to hear his tale. "It started with my great-grandfather," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was a woodsman, lived deep in the forest, far from any village or town. One day, while clearing a patch of land, he stumbled upon something buried beneath the roots of an ancient tree. It was this box." His fingers tapped the smooth, polished surface of the object in his lap. "At first, he thought it was just an old relic, something left behind by a forgotten people. But when he brought it home, strange things started happening. He'd hear whispers at night, faint and indistinct, as though someone was speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in places he'd already searched. And then, there were the dreams." The man's voice faltered, and he swallowed hard before continuing. "My great-grandfather would dream of shadowy figures watching him from the edges of the forest. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there staring. He said it felt like they were waiting for something. Eventually, he grew too frightened to keep the box in his home, so he buried it again, back where he found it." The congregation listened in stunned silence, their imaginations painting vivid pictures of the man's story. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and one older woman crossed herself, whispering a prayer under her breath. The priest remained stoic, though his fingers tightened around his rosary. "But it didn't stop there," the man continued, his voice shaking. "The whispers followed him. The dreams got worse. He started seeing the figures even when he was awake. They'd be there, standing in the shadows, watching. He became paranoid, convinced the box had cursed him. That's when he decided to bring it to a priest, not unlike yourself, Father. The priest raised an eyebrow but said nothing, allowing the man to continue. My great-grandfather confessed everything to the priest and begged him to bless the box or destroy it. The priest tried. He sprinkled holy water, recited prayers, even performed an exorcism. But none of it worked. In fact, the man hesitated, his face pale. He said it made things worse. The box would rattle on its own, like something was trying to get out. The priest told him to take it far away and hide it where no one would ever find it, and that's what he did. The man paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. But somehow, it always found its way back. My great-grandfather buried it deep in the woods, miles from his home. A week later, it was sitting on his doorstep. He threw it into a river, weighted down with rocks. Days later, it was on his table. No matter what he did, it came back. Eventually, he gave up and passed it down to my grandfather, who passed it down to my father, and now, to me. The congregation erupted into murmurs, their disbelief and fear spilling over in a wave of hushed voices. How could you bring something like that here? One man demanded. What if it's dangerous? The stranger looked up, his eyes hollow and filled with guilt. I didn't know what else to do. My father always said we were its caretakers, that it was our family's burden to bear. But I couldn't handle it anymore. I thought maybe the church could help. Maybe someone here could figure out what it is, or how to get rid of it. The priest's expression darkened. You said your family was told to never open it, he said. Yet you did. Why? The man hesitated, his face contorted with shame. It was calling to me, he admitted. For years I tried to ignore it, but the dreams wouldn't stop. The whispers got louder. Every time I touched the box, I felt something, like it was alive. I thought that maybe if I opened it, I could understand it, control it, but I was wrong. Alive? Someone in the congregation echoed, their voice trembling. What do you mean, alive? The man shook his head, his hands gripping the box tightly. I don't know how to explain it. It's not just an object. It feels aware, like it knows me, like it knows all of us. The priest exchanged a concerned glance with a few members of the congregation who remained close to the altar. This is not something we can ignore, he said firmly. Whatever this is, it does not belong in this house of God. We must seek divine guidance. The stranger looked up, desperation etched into his face. You have to help me, he pleaded. I can't take it back. I won't. It's yours now. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over the congregation like a shroud. For the first time, the priest felt a flicker of doubt. Could they truly confront whatever darkness lay within that box? Or had the man brought them something far beyond their understanding, or salvation? The church was quiet now, eerily so, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The black box remained on the altar, its brass clasp reflecting faint flickers of candlelight. The congregation had mostly dispersed after the priest advised them to leave, though a few remained, those too shaken or too curious to abandon the scene. The man who had brought the box sat in a pew near the front, his face buried in his hands, while the priest stood nearby, his fingers gripping his rosary tightly as he prayed silently. Authorities had been called, not out of a belief that they could resolve the situation, but as a precaution. The priest had no idea how to handle the unsettling object, or the fear it had unleashed upon his congregation. When the officers arrived, they too were hesitant. Two uniformed men approached the altar cautiously, their gazes fixed on the box as if it might spring to life. What exactly is this thing? One of them asked, his voice low. His partner, visibly uneasy, hung back a step, his hand resting instinctively on his holstered weapon. The priest sighed, his normally composed demeanor faltering for a moment. We're not entirely sure, he admitted. But I can tell you this, it is not normal. There is something deeply wrong about it. I can feel it, and so can everyone else who has been near it. The officer nodded grimly, then gestured for the man who brought the box to join them. "Sir, you need to explain this," he said. "Where did this come from, and why did you bring it here?" The man lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and tired. "I've already told them," he said hoarsely. "It's been in my family for generations. It's cursed or possessed or I don't know what. I brought it here because I thought the church could help. But now I see I've just made things worse." The officer frowned, glancing at the box again. "Possessed? Cursed? That's a bold claim. Is there any proof of that, or is this just some kind of family superstition?" Before the man could respond, a sudden noise cut through the silence, a faint scraping sound like nails on wood. Everyone froze. The officer closest to the box took a step back, his eyes widening. Did anyone else hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The priest nodded, his face pale. "It's been making noises," he said quietly. "I thought it might be in my head at first, but now I see it's real." The officer exchanged a nervous glance with his partner. "All right," he said, his tone firm despite his clear discomfort. "We're going to take this thing out of here. If it's causing this much trouble, it shouldn't stay in the church." As they reached for the box, the air in the room seemed to shift. It grew colder, the chill biting through clothing and skin. The candles flickered violently, some going out entirely, plunging parts of the room into shadow. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, followed by what sounded like a low, guttural growl. The officer pulled his hand back as though burned, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. No one answered. The man who had brought the box began to shake, his lips moving in silent prayer. The priest stepped forward, clutching his rosary tightly. "We cannot let it leave like this," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "If it is truly cursed, we must find a way to contain it. Taking it out into the world could make things worse." The officers hesitated, clearly torn between their duty and their fear. Finally, the senior officer nodded. "All right, but we're staying here. No one else goes near it until we figure out what's going on." Over the next several hours, the church became a hub of quiet chaos. Experts in various fields were consulted, though most dismissed the story outright. A historian examined the box, noting that its design and craftsmanship didn't match any known era or culture. "It's almost like it doesn't belong anywhere," she said, her voice tinged with unease. A linguist attempted to decipher the notes found inside, but the symbols defied interpretation. "They're not runes, not hieroglyphs, not any known script," he said, baffled. "It's almost as if this language was created by something inhuman." As night fell, the sense of unease in the church deepened. Those who had stayed began reporting strange experiences, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, shadows that moved unnaturally, an overwhelming sense of being watched. The priest tried to maintain calm, leading prayers and blessings, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. At one point, the man who had brought the box stood abruptly, his face a mask of terror. "It's calling to me again," he said, his voice shaking. "I can hear it. It wants me to take it back." The priest placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You must resist," he said. "Whatever this is, it preys on weakness and fear. Stay strong." But the man's resolve was crumbling. "You don't understand," he said, his eyes wild. "It doesn't just call, it commands. It's inside my head." The priest tightened his grip. "We will find a way to stop this," he said. "Have faith." But faith alone seemed insufficient. The night wore on, and the strange occurrences grew more intense. Objects moved on their own. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the windows despite the mild weather outside. A sense of dread hung heavy in the air, pressing down on everyone present. By dawn, the black box remained on the altar, its mysteries unsolved. The man who had brought it was nowhere to be found, having fled during the night. The authorities, shaken by what they had witnessed, decided to leave the box in the church, deeming it too dangerous to move. To this day, the black box remains locked in a sealed chamber within the church, guarded by those who know its story. No one dares to open it again, and its origins remain a haunting mystery. Some say the box is a relic of an ancient evil. Others believe it is a gateway to something far worse. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. The box has left an indelible mark on everyone who has encountered it, a chilling reminder that some secrets are better left buried.